Well, welcome to the Premier Living podcast. My name is Will Marsh. I'm the Director of Education and Quantum Systems here at Premier Research Labs. And I'm so excited to be joined live for today's recording with Dr. John Poothullil, or Lee. Sorry, I might have mispronounced that, Dr. John. But Dr. John has a decade's worth of experience working in clinical practice. And, if you're familiar with his name, he actually has a really unique perspective in regards to diabetes, which I would argue, and I would probably agree with most of our practitioners that are listening into this, is one of those issues that really, I think, is the most important to address as a nation and a society in today's age. It is one of the leading causes for financial burden to our economy, our healthcare system, and beyond. And so Dr. John has been recognized across the world in regards to his expertise and really his perspective on why diabetes arises and kind of what is insulin resistance, right? And so I'm so excited to be here today with Dr. John. And Dr. John, I just want to say thank you for joining us on today's Premier Living podcast.
I thank you for having me. As you know, there are 500 million people in the world right now with type 2 diabetes, and is supposed to double in the next 30 years. So this is a very important topic, and I thank you for addressing this and bringing this to the attention of the population at large.
Yeah, I mean, we have an audience of consumers and health practitioners that are listening in, and I think it's really important, maybe for those listening, to share kind of your background. And you came from much so the kind of American Western medicine philosophy, right, in regards to diabetes and type 2 diabetes management. So maybe as we begin today's conversation, if you'd be willing to share your story around how you came to your conclusions, and with all these books that you've co-authored and authored, I think it'd be worth just kind of sharing that story of how you came to this unique conclusion around diabetes.
Thank you for that question. I grew up in India. I had my medical degree from there. I went to Scotland to do internship. I came to the United States in 1970, did my residency. I did practice in the state of Texas for over 35 years. During my residency and fellowship, my relative had type 2 diabetes. Her husband was a medical college professor who treated her, kept her A1C below 7 using insulin, yet she had to have amputation of one leg. At that time, I thought the doctors will change the treatment plan because insulin did not help. But they continued the same treatment. And within a year and a half, she had the other leg amputated. That is what set me on the path to understand what is type 2 diabetes. Why is insulin not preventing the complications of type 2 diabetes?
Yeah, it's one of those paradigms where in the traditional medicine system, a lot of times it's just a recommendation of more and more insulin rather than actually working to maybe address the causative factors around why the body's mismanaging or not sensitive to insulin. And so maybe for those that were listening in, would you be willing to define your perspective on type 2 diabetes and what is insulin resistance, or even if there is insulin resistance in the body?
The endocrinologists claim when there is high levels of insulin and glucose at the same time in the blood, that is a sign of resistance to the action of insulin. But the problem is association does not prove causation. If there is resistance to insulin, first we have to understand what is the role of insulin. When somebody comes to visit you, How do you know there is somebody outside? They either knock on the door, ring the doorbell, or you have a camera to see who is outside. Still, you have the option to open the door or not. So every cell in the body can use glucose, but glucose cannot ring the doorbell. That is the job of insulin. So in type 1 diabetes, there is no insulin. So the glucose accumulates outside the cell, but cells inside are starving. Whereas in type 2 diabetes, there is plenty of insulin, plenty of glucose, but the cell is not letting glucose in. Why? On the other hand, you will find all the cells working normally, which suggests that the cell is able to produce energy needed for metabolism using an alternate fuel, such as fatty acid. This is similar to a hybrid engine in a car, either running on electricity or gasoline. When it is using one fuel, it does not need the other one. That doesn't mean it is resistant to the other one. This is the argument that the endocrinologists use as if to force the cell to use glucose and glucose only.
So just to kind of summarize in your perspective and what you've seen clinically, and a lot of times it's not that in a type 2 diabetic that they're not able to produce energy, they're just using an alternate fuel source, right? Their hybrid engine is maybe attuned to a different process. And of course, they're not letting glucose into the cell. And maybe for those that are for our audience, how would you kind of consult, when somebody is presenting more type 2 diabetes symptoms? Is it more that we're trying to allow the body to use glucose, or are we actually working to continue to empower that fatty acid mobilization and utilization in the client?
First of all, in type 1 diabetes, the high blood sugar is because of underutilization of glucose. In type 2, it is oversupply of glucose. So these are completely two different problems. Mm-hmm. Suppose you had a good meal, and if I bring in more food, and if you don't eat it, should I force you to eat it? That is what is happening when you give somebody insulin in type 2 diabetes. So keep in mind, in type 1 diabetes, they need insulin to survive. I have no problem with that. But whereas they have applied the same formula to type 2. So it is like a bait and switch.
Yeah. It's, we can go probably down the rabbit hole of why that bait and switch is happening. But I think, maybe for today, we'll stay centered on, kind of the clinical focus on how to manage, instead of force feeding the cell, right? Giving the body more insulin, driving more glucose into the cell, causing perhaps insulin resistance, right? Because the body has too much insulin. What is, in your perspective, what are some really good strategies to better center clients and even practitioners that are working with clients that are facing a type 2 diagnosis, in your opinion?
The main thing is we need to start asking questions. We have accepted what endocrinologists have told us for the last 40, 50 years. If you take insulin or insulin-based treatment, and if you still have kidney problems, if you still have vision problems, still have heart problems, don't wait. Ask the question, if I continue insulin, continue the same line of treatment, will it stop my complications of diabetes. If there is no evidence, why are we keep doing it? I don't understand why the endocrinologist can keep on prescribing insulin to treat type 2 diabetes or medications that cause release of insulin in the body without long-term controlled studies showing benefit of preventing complications. We don't have that.
Yeah.
So what has happened is companies that produce monitoring devices to continuously monitor blood glucose, they get the benefit of, all they have to say is, oh, you monitor it and your diabetes is under control. All you have to know is the number, and magically the diabetes disappears. What we have to make sure is glucose control is not diabetes control.
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction because most people that have a type 2 diagnosis are just focusing on managing glucose, right? They're saying, oh, if the glucose goes down in the blood, then obviously I'm managing my quote unquote symptomologies, when truthfully, those symptomologies could be manifestation of dysfunction or pathophysiology in certain organ gland systems. Do you have some questions that you really like to help, whether they're for practitioners or even consumers, to maybe ask, if they're facing a type 2 diabetes diagnosis, they're looking to manage blood glucose, how they can maybe have greater awareness of what may be a better route to really support health outcomes?
Absolutely. If you don't start asking questions, endocrinologists have no reason to answer. So the first question is, everybody get metformin. And how does metformin work? When you take metformin, let us say the blood glucose went down. Where did that glucose go? Most people think that the glucose went out through the urine. The same with insulin. When you take insulin, blood glucose goes down. Where does it go? These kinds of questions, if we don't ask, endocrinologists have no reason to explain what happened. They themselves don't know. So they were just hiding under the benefits received by type 1 diabetics.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at all the advertisements on the TV for type 2 diabetes medications, they will say that it will bring your blood sugar down, but they will never say it will prevent you from having complications in the long term. So
Yeah,
first, just start asking questions
it's true. And
before it is too late.
I guess
Because once your kidneys are gone, you cannot bring it back.
and would you say in a lot of ways, and what you've seen in clinical practice a lot of times is, somebody that has had a maybe a long-term recommendation of insulin, and they're using insulin as blood glucose management, right? Managing the symptomology, that a lot of times that is when you have perhaps kidney or liver kind of breakdown pathophysiologies in those systems, or what tends to be the weakest link in the body, from your perspective, when somebody is just for a type 2 diabetic, managing that with insulin?
When you give insulin, insulin instructs the liver to convert that glucose into fat. It is the fat that blocks the artery going to the kidney, going to your eye, going to your heart, going to your brain, going to your leg. So you're covering up the obvious symptom, that is high blood sugar. But you are paying later on for all the complications. All you have to do is look at people who have kept A1C below 7 for years, still having kidney problems, high problem, all these same complications of type 2 diabetes. So what is the point in keeping blood sugar down using insulin?
It's true. I guess the aspect that I would maybe, and the question I would maybe pose, for you is how do you, somebody that, has a type 2 diagnosis, right? And, they've maybe used insulin initially, and they're facing that next kind of up, prescription of amount of insulin. you how do you help them adopt maybe lifestyle strategies and dietary strategies that really change the picture of how their body is nourished? Because in a lot of ways, I would, and probably you would agree, that it really requires people to change how they're living their lives to manage type 2 diabetes and work through that and really find a quote unquote space of homeostasis and health. But I know that's probably the most difficult question to ask people, because that does require them to perhaps change their behavior. And so how do you navigate that conversation as a physician?
That is an excellent question. And this is where the hard part comes in. Because once you are used to a certain way of eating, it is very hard to change. Especially if you are one member of the family, the whole family has to pitch in. Otherwise, you will fall back to the same thing. Just like a person who loses weight using a program and then goes back to the same way of eating as before and then gain it all back. So you have one example I can suggest is the experience of Native Americans. When they were brought to the reservations in the year 1900, they practically had no type 2 diabetes. Now, the adults in the reservation of Arizona, 50% of them are either type 2 diabetic or pre-diabetic. Why? What is the difference? The native habitat, these Native Americans moved from one food source to another. They ate everything: fruits, nuts, tubers, vegetables, eggs, animals, birds. But they did not eat one thing. Can you think of what it is?
I would probably guess highly processed foods, but that's nobody was eating back in the day.
That's true. But more fundamentally, they did not stay in one place to cultivate grains, rice, wheat, or corn. Yes, they did eat wild corn during season, but they did not have grain-based foods, which is the basis for most of the processed foods also. So the government started subsidizing grain farming, and about $25 billion a year. The net result is the complex carbohydrate part of dietary energy intake has gone up from 30%, which was before the green revolution, to 50% in developed countries and up to 70% in developing countries. This doubling and tripling of the carbohydrate part of the food energy intake is directly contributing to obesity, type 2 diabetes, cancer, and the next epidemic will be dementia and Alzheimer's.
Yeah, it's the overabundance, right, of carbohydrates in a lot of ways that tends to cause the body to break down, right? And this is where you get the first maybe aspect of that is a type 2 diabetic diagnosis or symptomology, right, of blood glucose mismanagement. But it's really just too much carbohydrates, right, being consumed by the body. What are your strategies to kind of, somebody might hear that, they might understand that I need to change, how many carbohydrates I'm eating. Do you have any tips and tools and tricks to help, whether it's a consumer or a practitioner, kind of advise clients to manage carbohydrate intake?
First, they need to understand and believe that they are in control, not the doctor, don't use a medication to control a number. So, what is the rationale of not using grains? That is where you have to start. In my opinion, nature never meant grains for humans. Otherwise, we would have had beaks to pick them up and the ability to digest the chaff. Thirdly, if you boil rice, can you enjoy rice by itself? Chances are no. Most people cannot enjoy just by itself. Any nutrient, any food, if that contains valuable nutrients for the body, when you introduce into your mouth, you will get a sense of enjoyment. How much can you enjoy plain boiled rice? So actually, when you mix it with something that you enjoy, you are reducing the enjoyment of what you are mixing it with. So you're not enjoying your meal. All you have to do is look at toddlers between 2 and 6 years of age. They don't know anything about nutrition, carbohydrate, fat, proteins, nothing. You will observe three things. One, they will eat only when they are hungry. As against us, we eat for any reason or no reason.
Right.
Second, they will pick and choose what they enjoy. Whereas we will eat because somebody made it. We want to please the host, or we want to get our money's worth, or it is free. Third, when the toddlers are satisfied, they could care less how much is left on the plate. They will go out and play. Whereas once we put it on the plate, we have to clean the plate. We would rather put it on our waste rather than in the waste basket.
I think it's you bring up a very interesting point, and I'm a very big believer in really trying to tune into an inner sense of authority on how you're making decisions and how you're actually making choices of what you eat, right? And I think in a lot of ways, so often we're conditioned, right, to have certain, like, whether we're pleasing another person because they're cooking the food, or maybe we're in a habitual pattern of consuming meals at certain times. So often we forget, we really should be looking inside internally for those cues of when we're hungry and what we want to eat, and adapting our diet based on those cravings. But I guess, maybe the counter argument is, a lot of people are conditioned to have cravings based on our food system, right? Where carbohydrates, and even how we were raised preferentially, we seek out, those easy sources of energy, which, are those processed grains or refined carbohydrates, where it's easy and it tastes perhaps really good. I mean, even for me personally, I don't usually put butter on my rice. I'm not, adding a lot of different sauces, but I still love, carbohydrates, right? It's just one of those things where it's that instant gratification, the dopamine pathway just kind of lights up. How do you help people navigate that aspect of conditioning around carbohydrate preference, even if, that they're craving it, but that's really not what they need? They need the more nutrient dense food, right? Because I know for me, even personally, sometimes I struggle with that.
Well, doing that occasionally is not a problem. Let us start with the simple question. Can you find in nature of any food an adult human being can get nutrients from without chewing?
I would say probably not.
No.
Everything does require, mastication to actually process that.
Right. So how much can you chew rice? cupcakes, cakes, ice cream, the soft foods, most of them made with complex carbohydrate from grains. And the people who market them, they enhance the flavor of these pre-processed foods with butter, salt, and flavor enhancers. So this is the problem. Yes, you get conditioned. I one time asked 10 overweight adults to write down the exact time they felt hungry and the time they ate. 4 out of 10 for 3 days never felt hungry. But that did not stop them from eating. When I asked why, they said it was because it was time to eat.
Goes back to the kind of the paradigm that we a lot of ways are trained like Pavlov's dogs, right? And we have
Exactly.
the bell that's ringing in our head, but it's not actually ringing physiologically around what we need. What do you have favorite kind of strategies to better cue, whether as a practitioner, create programs to help support kind of that internal authority rising up in the consumer or the client to like really understand where they're hungry? Is there things that you've seen in practice that really seem to work effectively in helping people more so tune into those internal signals?
Well, an interesting question is, can you predict when you are going to be hungry next? Nobody can. But how does the brain know when to create the sensation of hunger? And each time you eat, the quantity that is needed to quench your hunger or satisfy you will be different, similar to the varying amounts of water that you will take or drink to quench your thirst. You cannot predetermine. So if you don't pay attention to the intensity of enjoyment of each bite you take and the reducing intensity of enjoyment, you cannot know when to stop. That is where, so you have to concentrate on each bite of food. Mindful eating, that is the key, along with cutting down on the complex carbohydrate portion of your diet. Most people gain weight gradually, a few pounds a year, and within 10-15 years it adds up. There is no hurry to lose your weight, even if you lose only 1 or 2 pounds a month. That is what it takes. As you keep doing it, you get used to the lower intake of complex carb, because complex carb provides extra energy that your body stores as fat. For most adults, after age 35, weight gain is fat gain, unless you do resistance training.
So I would love, I think when we look at like the dietary programming that's kind of out in the world, there's a lot of, practitioners, right, that might, immediately recommend when they're seeing a client that maybe is facing a type 2 diagnosis, they might actually put them on a intermittent fasting diet, and they might, drastically change their eating behavior. In your perspective, and kind of through this discussion, right, it really is more of a paradigm of encouraging mindfulness, right, which really allows the client to more intuitively feel when they're hungry and when they're satiated and what they're actually craving, and working to kind of balance all of those factors to really help to better manage weight. And so how would you kind of proposition, somebody, because somebody obviously that's facing a type 2 diagnosis, right, or is maybe having insulin insensitivity just over time, they're seeing weight gain, they may adopt a strategy that is very dramatic, right? They're essentially cutting caloric consumption, they're cutting meal timing, and they may see results, but then there's the yo-yo effect. And so, in your perspective, do you agree with implementation of strategies like this, or do you really more so, like we've talked about already?
Can I continue?
You can, yeah. Sorry.
Okay. Whether you eat on a time schedule, each time we eat in between meals, we are fasting. So if you want to extend the duration of fast, that's entirely up to you. When you eat, how many times you eat those are immaterial. What is material is the total quantity of food energy that you consume and where that comes from. So if we can cut down on the portion of complex carbohydrate coming from grains, take your time to enjoy each bite of food. Start eating when you are hungry. You are in control. And don't worry about the speed of weight loss, because if you lose it too fast, your system cannot adjust and you develop cravings. If you take a medication to suppress your hunger, you may not be able to provide the body with needed nutrients on a timely fashion. So when you stop the medication, you gain all your weight back. Whereas if you can train yourself, reduce the volume of food intake, gradually lose your weight, your system get adjusted, and you can keep that go for the rest of your life.
It's true. It creates a longevity in the weight loss and the weight management paradigm. I'm curious, actually, we've talked about insulin and, why practitioners, and medical doctors, maybe physicians are recommending insulin left and right, and why that's perhaps not the best recommendation for long-term management of type 2 diabetes. I would love if you're willing to share your perspective on Ozempic. You've kind of alluded to it, but I think it's important given that a lot of consumers, they may not be even facing a type 2 diagnosis, but they're turning to Ozempic for helping with weight management or helping just to maybe reclaim the look that they had 10 years ago because it may help them lose weight. Would you be willing to share your perspective on Ozempic?
When food is introduced into your mouth, a signal goes to the brain and one to the intestine. The brain gets ready to send a signal to the pancreas to release insulin and digestive enzymes. The intestine gets ready to start working on digestion. But the actual signals will be released from the intestine only when the food reaches the intestine. Then there is a signal going from the intestine to the brain to reduce the intensity of hunger and to the pancreas to release insulin. This signaling molecule should last only about 6 to 8 minutes. What Ozempic is the same signaling molecule modified in the laboratory to last 6 to 8 hours. So during that time, you don't feel hungry and your pancreas keep releasing insulin. So naturally, you eat less, you lose weight. The problem is you are upsetting the natural control mechanisms. You may not get needed nutrients on a timely fashion because you are fasting, you are not hungry for a long period of time. Once you stop the medication, the whole control mechanism is messed up. and you regain the weight. And in addition, we don't know what the long-term complications are going to be when insulin release is more prolonged, because it is not supposed to be like that. So you may have complications that we don't know yet. Just like the previous weight loss drug, fen-phen, created heart problems that we did not recognize for a long time. So be careful. Instead of using a medication to lose weight, keep in mind it is not the medication that causes loss of weight. It is you're eating less because of the medication. So even if you don't have the medication, if you eat less, you can lose the weight without any complication from the medication.
I think it's once again, so often we as human beings, we like to find shortcuts, right? And we like to take the easy way out and not necessarily do the hard work to really enforce learned patterns that really provide sustainability for what is longevity and health span. I guess in Dr. John, I just want to say thank you, for your time in regard. I mean, you're a seasoned practitioner. You've come to this conclusion after being kind of indoctrinated into kind of the Western philosophy, and you've come up for air and you've kind of seen, hey, this isn't working. What would you like to see? And I think there's a lot of factors that go into why we're kind of in the society that we are today in terms of how we're making recommendations around medication to create these crutches, right? And to create these shortcuts. What do you feel like has to change, right? To really create a medical practice that is recognized across the country and really hopefully around the world, that really enforces allowing and empowering people to really choose their innate and intuition in terms of how they're making dietary choices and what they need. And I mean, there's a lot of different pillars into the whole aspect of why we're here today. What do you feel like in the next 5 to 10 years would be the most beneficial change that we as a society could really culminate with, that really creates a different paradigm of how physicians are approaching these subjects of weight management, type 2 diabetes, etc.?
Right now, we give it to the patients. What we don't understand is even those who are not affected directly are paying a price. Let me tell you why. If you look at healthcare costs, Medicare, Medicaid, hospitalization cost, they are all going to be underwater unless we increase the tax. The tax is paid by everybody. And the majority of expenses, medical healthcare expenses right now, is related to weight gain, type 2 diabetes, and its complications. So management of type 2 diabetes is critical for the health of the healthcare industry, or using healthcare dollars in a better way. So if the government wants to control healthcare costs, all it has to do right now is look at the cost-benefit analysis of what we are paying, first to promote cultivation of grains, second to pay for type 2 diabetes treatment without any proven benefits, and paying about 10 billion or more of taxpayer money to devices that monitor blood glucose on a continuous basis. We don't monitor blood pressure continuously, cholesterol continuously, our breathing pattern continuously, our heart rate continuously. Why only glucose? What is the benefit? There is no reduction in the incidence of complications, long-term complications of diabetes. in people who use continuous monitoring compared to others who don't use it but use diet to control their blood sugar. So every one of us has to ask questions. Are we using our tax dollars in the right way when it comes to healthcare management? Ask our congressmen, our senators. It has to start from them.
Yeah, really. I think it's encouraging that all parties involved in how we manage policy and how we create reimbursement, like just policy globally, right, across any segment of the healthcare, are informed, right, as to what their decisions and what their policies, how those may enforce behavioral patterns in our society. I think what's really exciting is some elected officials are waking up. There's actually a bill that was recently passed and will be enacted in Texas, for example, that has over, I believe it's like 70 different processed food products actually have labeling on it that says not intended for human consumption on the product itself. And I think that's a really good, and these are candies and processed foods that, essentially are eaten regularly by people, on a daily basis. And now imagine that there's this label on the food that says not intended for human consumption. I think that may allow people to maybe wake up. And so, if we can communicate around how foods and how certain aspects of health, like health choices, may be detrimental over time, people can start to make better and more informed decisions, because so often there's this habitual pattern, right, of like I'm just going to reach for the Twinkie or the Skittles, and because I need a sweet treat, when hey, well, now there's labeling on there that says this is not good for human consumption.
Yeah, we all enjoy eating. The question is, do we enjoy what we eat? Is it safe? Is it beneficial? Just think like that.
That's so true. And I know, Dr. John, you've actually written a couple books on maybe how to empower people to make healthier dietary decisions through the foods that they cook. There's some recipes and some cookbooks that you've made. Would you kind of be willing to share how you came up with writing those books and kind of the background to how those books came to life?
The first question is, when I talked about the diabetes, I wanted to educate people. So I wrote the book, Diabetes, the Real Cause and the Right Cure, to emphasize the point insulin resistance is not the cause of type 2 diabetes. It is increased intake complex carbohydrates coming from the grains. So all you have to do is to reduce the portion of complex carbohydrate in your daily meal. When I give a talk, people will start asking that, what can I eat? So I came up with a recipe book, the diabetes-free cookbook and exercise guide. When I gave a talk on that, now there are more and more vegetarians who said, well, what do we eat? So I just released Beat Diabetes with Indian vegetarian cooking. Then there are people who have a family history of diabetes. They don't want to get diabetes. So I just releasing the book, Beat Unwanted Weight Gain, 7 ways to lose pounds and never regain them. Then I have 2 other books on cancer and one on information management. Thank you for asking that question.
Well, you're a true steward of health, and I think you're a plethora of resources and knowledge. And so, I encourage anybody that's listened into this conversation to maybe look at those books as resources and guides to kind of help them on their mission. And practitioners, it's a great way to learn from your perspective, right? How they can incorporate maybe some of those strategies with their clients, right? Maybe as we end today, I know you've written that book on 7 ways to beat diabetes. Is there one way that we haven't covered today in regards to mindfulness, intentional eating, looking to kind of change the dietary selection that you would like to highlight to get people more engaged and more empowered around, really diabetes management?
Again, before I forget, my website is drjohnonhealth.com, and I don't sell any supplements, or I don't have any sponsors. I spend my own money to promote this idea because I believe each person should take charge of his or her own health. We all enjoy eating. All I am asking is enjoy each bite. Concentrate on what is in your mouth each time you take a bite of food. We can enjoy eating from the moment we are born until we die. That is the only enjoyment we can do multiple times a day and still get full enjoyment. So don't be distracted by watching a TV, watching a game, or even concentrating on a talk or a speech, because you don't get the full enjoyment of eating. So eat what you enjoy, but more importantly, enjoy what you eat.
Honestly, that in itself, I think, is the biggest hack to weight management. I can't tell you how many, even myself personally, there's so many times where I'm reading an article or watching an informative lecture on YouTube, or I'm kind of immersed in something else, and I'm not actually focused on the meal. And then you come up and the meal's completed, and you haven't been a part of that meal, right? And then so often you're seeking more food to kind of satiate the sensation because you were tuned out. And I think, practicing mindfulness, practicing intentionality, really grounding into mealtime, right? That is so intrinsically rewarding, right? But so often we distract ourselves from that because we believe it's too mundane, right? To chew your food and appreciate the food. But honestly, that is one of the biggest pillars to really unlocking full nutritive value of that food, not only from a nutrition standpoint, but a psychological, emotional standpoint, because it really allows full integration of the food that we're consuming. So, Dr. John, I think you actually shared the hack right there to close us out. And for those that are listening, please, I do encourage you to look at all of Dr. John's resources. And if you are looking at supplementation, which, we believe here at Premier Research Labs that food really is the pillar to health, and really having meals that are, nutrient dense, nutrient rich, and really personalized for your needs, that creates longevity. But sometimes you do need to supplement, right? And, we've talked about big food, but a lot of times, the foods that we're consuming sometimes don't have enough nutrition, or we're not able to dietarily get herbs and botanicals that may help to kind of move us along. And so working with a practitioner, right, to kind of help do a full, complete program that really incorporates diet, lifestyle, and mindfulness, that really is going to be the full way to really kind of ascend and work into what is an optimized health span. So if you're interested, reach out to your practitioner, or if you're a practitioner listening in, we'd be happy to consult you on those strategies even more. But Dr. John, I do just want to again say thank you so much for your time and truly being a true steward of health management and diabetes management in our society today. I think today's conversation was very grounding for me. And I know when I'll be enjoying lunch later, I will be very intentional with every bite that I take. So I maybe encourage everybody listening in to do the same. But Dr. John, is there anything that you wanted to share in closing today with our audience?
Yes, go for a variety of vegetables, variety of fruits, variety of nuts. Supplement that with herbs and spices. Explore new tastes from other countries and enjoy them. Be mindful of what you put in your mouth. Once you put it in your mouth, enjoy each bite. And you are in control. There is no magic about controlling your health and the nutrient intake. It is not that difficult. But when you eat, that is your private time. Don't let it be bothered or interfered with other distractions. Concentrate, enjoy.
Thank you so much, Dr. John. And thank you for everybody for tuning in and listening in on this episode of the Premier Living Podcast, where we share transformational conversations to change the lives of our global population. So, Dr. John, again, thank you for your time and your stewardship. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you for having me.